Good morning. We got great presentation for you guys today. Thanks for joining us. As our presenters today, my name is Steve Nebbia. I'm a consulting director here. I lead our outsourced accounting offering. Have some experience doing budgets for individual, myself, and for organizations that we work with on an outsourced accounting basis. So you'll hear a little bit about individual budgets, a little bit about savings, and a little bit about organizations today. We'll go through a more in-depth agenda in a moment.
Yep, I'm Joe Carlson. I'm a senior financial planner in the Lutz financial division. I've been here for about 5.5 years, and I kind of focus on providing comprehensive financial planning and wealth management services to high net worth individuals, families, and like small to medium-sized business owners. So like Steve said, we're kind of going to hit on a lot of all things budgeting, which I know is everyone's favorite topic, but it's very relevant, and it's really something that's relevant to everyone, whether you're an individual or a business owner. So dive into the fun stuff.
So we want to talk about examples. We were talking about our presentation last week, and we were talking about, why somebody would need a budget or why this was relevant, and if we could provide a real world example. And we both kind of laughed because we're actually each in a different situation where budgeting and being thoughtful about how we're spending and saving is really important. I've had 3 kids in the last 5 years and have moved, so lots of expenses, lots of one-time things that need to be planned for. Now I've got college coming up to worry about. I've got, retirement to worry about long ways down the road. But all of this kind of works to say, as you're going through life, there's things that are going to come up that are unexpected, they're one time, and being able to budget and plan around that is really important.
Yeah, and I'm kind of on the early end of what Steve is kind of coming off the back of, where I'm actually expecting my first kid here in a couple of months. And I am moving into a new house here, hopefully a month before then. So kind of doing it all in 1 year. But, my first 5 or 6 years so far of my career, we'll talk a lot about goals here in a second. But I've been heavily focusing on kind of more of these shorter term goals, knowing that building a house, buying a wedding ring, cars, things like that, for the more short term expenses has kind of been a priority for me up to this point. While I'm also kind of still thinking about long-term goals, retirement, things like that, but kind of been playing a balancing act between these short and long-term goals. We were laughing because we're kind of both in similar but also different situations, and it really is relevant to what we'll talk about today in terms of the importance of setting goals and how to leverage, kind of the different types of savings and investment accounts available to you, or really developing a savings plan alongside a budget, and kind of how it applies to you. I know we're probably talking to people that kind of span the spectrum of age. You might be starting off your career, you may be a business owner, but really setting goals in our eyes is really the way to is a crucial first step in establishing or really building your financial plan for everyone, no matter who you are. So we have on here setting SMART goals. It sounds like a kind of a cliche framework for setting goals, but really it is a really good framework to use or to start with. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals. To kind of to put it in an example, and how this would apply would be, let's use building a house. We're saving up for a down payment on a house, call it the next 3 to 5 years. Establishing a specific goal, whether it's, if your goal is to put, 20% down on a house is a good general starting point or goal when you're buying a house. So setting a specific goal, what type of house do you think you're going to want? What's 20% of that? And that gives you the concrete, that's the goal that you're trying to achieve. Measurable, figure out if your goal is in 3 years, how much are you going to have to put away on a monthly or annual basis to get to that point or to save that exact amount. Short-term goals are easy to measure because I'll talk about this a little later, but short-term goals, call it the 3 to 5 year type goals. I believe that's called savings, not investing. Generally, we don't recommend putting money in the stock market or being aggressive with funds that you're going to need on a short-term basis. So the short-term goals are easy to be measured because you're really not factoring in much growth other than maybe some interest on the bank account type assets. So making something that's measurable and able to follow along, something that's achievable or reasonable. It's really about setting a reasonable goal that's within your lifestyle spend and what your income limits are. And you can always factor in if you think your income's going to go up over time, and if your lifestyle spend is also probably going to go up, whether it's inflation or just lifestyle drift. But setting reasonable and achievable goals is an important aspect of this too. Relevant, the goal has to be relevant, of course, to your family and your personal wants and needs, and then time bound. Again, that's where you set whether it's a short-term goal, midterm goal, long-term goal. It's an important piece of the puzzle there is figuring out if what the timeline is and how you're going to get there. And again, the importance of financial goals. Sorry, can you go back one time? The importance of financial goals, again, I just kind of hit on it, but in my eyes, the biggest one is it really kind of provides you motivation for managing your money effectively. Hitting on long-term goals specifically, being young and starting your career, it feels like retirement is way out, which probably is. So it's really easy to kind of bury your head in the sand and to not think about the importance of saving for retirement early on because you have so many years to make up for it. Well, if you actually start establishing these short, mid, long-term goals early on as you're trying to develop a budget, it gives you that motivation of actually feeling the impact on a monthly or annual basis, and if you're doing enough to kind of get towards your goals. This is one of my favorite slides because it really oversimplifies the utility or kind of the value of money. But this basically says there's 4 things, and we always say this, there's 4 things that you can do with your money. Really, you can owe it, whether it's paying taxes or paying down debt. You can grow it by putting away money in savings and investing it. You can live it, which everyone enjoys doing. But lifestyle spending, day-to-day needs, you name it, anything that you're actually spending money on. And then you can also give it, whether it's giving it to charity or getting it to other people. But really, ultimately, budgeting is kind of the tool that allows you to wrap all 4 of these things into, or figure out how all 4 of these are going to apply to you and kind of your short, midterm, and long-term goals.
So we've kind of touched on this already, but why budget? You think about those 4 goals, or you think about those 4 buckets or your financial goals. Getting from point A to point B, the budget is like a roadmap to get through 1 year at a time, or a continual budget where it's constantly updating. Maybe it's 1 month at a time, but moving from where we're at today to those financial goals and using that SMART strategy of setting the specific goals, the measurable goals, to get from point A to point B. It also can help reduce financial stress and uncertainty. I know a lot of times we get a credit card bill that seems a little too high, and it's just, kind of comes out of nowhere, and we don't know how that happened. And we go back and look through it, and everything seems reasonable. It's all expenses we expected to happen, but we weren't really adding it up. We didn't think it was going to get to that level. And having a budget, having a plan kind of allows you to see where those things are going to happen and when to expect those kind of surprises. And then the last thing, having a budget promotes living within your financial limits. I think a lot of times we see folks not budget, go ahead and spend, go ahead and get outside of where they probably should be, and they incur debt. A lot of times it's credit card debt. Other times it's coming from sources that it really shouldn't be coming from. And that's how you end up with a longer term problem. Whereas if you were to budget, you might understand when you have the opportunity to kind of have some more lifestyle spending, have some more disposable income, or there might be times when you are expecting that larger credit card bill or the expenses that kind of hit one time a year to hit. And so you know to rein in the spending on your lifestyle or your discretionary.
Yeah, I guess, and just real quick to add to that is, I'll mention this several times, but kind of lifestyle drift is what I'll call it. The importance of living within your financial limits from an early on, or even if you're starting out your career, even if you expect to start making more money quickly, it's important to live within your limits early on and establish those savings, those savings habits, and we'll talk about automated savings as well. But because it's easy if you start off and spending most of your paychecks because you think you're going to have time to save and you're going to make more money. But really what we see a lot of times is if you start off like that and you don't instill these savings habits early on, when you start making more money, it's easy to just keep increasing the spend or kind of that lifestyle drift. If you don't start these savings habits early, you're always going to want to spend more, especially as a reward for as your income going up. If you don't start these savings early, then we a lot of times see this lifestyle drift. So, we'll talk about the savings, but it's an important thing to mention too.
So creating a budget, there's a lot of different ways to create a budget, and we'll get into that. But a couple things that need to exist before we can get into which type of budget works or how we go about actually putting a budget together. Expenses and income need to be tracked accurately. That's fairly easy with today's day and age. Bank accounts, credit card statements, all of that information's online. It's broken out by transactions. And a lot of times those sources will actually categorize those expenses for you, which is really helpful because the next thing we're going to want to do is categorize these expenses into categories that might be specific, but in general need to include, hey, what do we need to pay? That goes back to, do we owe it? Is it taxes? Is it debt? Or is it needs where it's, hey, I need to pay my utility bill. I need to go to the grocery store. There's things that we have to spend money on that we can't avoid. And then there's the discretionary spending. Am I going out to restaurants for dinner? Am I playing golf? Am I doing other things that I could cut out if I needed to rein back spending? Given a couple examples of my personal choices, but everybody's got their own way to spend their discretionary income, and those need to be broken out separately. The last couple things are all around saving. We need to make sure that we're being thoughtful about saving, make sure that we're taking care of our debts. We're building in a buffer for the rainy day fund, the unexpected expenses. Hey, a car breaks down, I need to go replace a part, or I need to get a new car altogether. How have I planned accordingly to have some leeway or have some flexibility to get something like that done? And then overall, the whole budget and the whole process should work towards those financial goals, which tend to be a little bit more long-term. I'm going to cover a few budgeting methods here, and we can take questions on any of these as we go. So if anybody does have questions, please reach out in the chat. First one I'm going to talk about is zero-based budgeting. This would allow us to start with our income for a period, which maybe that's a month, maybe that's a year, take out the debt payments, take out the taxes, and then split up the rest into categories that we want to get the net to zero. This is probably a hybrid or a part of what most people do for a budget. However, this involves getting that number to zero without having a specific order or maybe saying we're going to make sure something's done first. It allows you to spread the budget into different categories as you want to. The next is incremental budgeting. This would be most useful if you had consistent income or your income was kind of growing at a cost of living adjustment every year and you felt comfortable with what happened the year before. You could take that, roll it forward, update for inflation, and say, I think I spent $1,000 on groceries last year. I know I'm going to spend $1,300 on groceries or $1,100 on groceries next year. And you can roll forward your budget year to year. And obviously, I think we'd all love to spend $1,100 on groceries in a year at this point. But the fact of the matter is you can roll forward those expense categories year to year and grow them at a rate that you think makes sense for that particular category. Easy to prepare, doesn't really allow for a lot of flexibility in terms of buying a house, buying a car, life changes. We had a kid. Those types of situations make this incremental budgeting a little bit inflexible, where we're not, building in that savings piece or building in some flexibility for changes in our life that are coming up.
Yeah, I'd say pros and cons. I mean, Steve just kind of hit on the incremental budgeting. Pro for the zero-based budgeting is, if you'd say you did it on an annual basis where you kind of start from scratch at the beginning of every year for your budget for that upcoming year, the con is that it's probably going to take you a while because you're going through reviewing all the different categories to spend and recategorizing things as your life changes. So whether it's savings or now you have a kid in the picture, whatever it is, it allows that flexibility, but also is probably going to be a little bit time consuming on the front end. And a lot of times time consuming means you just kick the can down the road and don't do it. But incremental budgeting pro is easy to implement. It's easy to roll it from year to year. But, a limitation, like Steve said, is as your life changes, which it inevitably will for everybody, it kind of doesn't allow you as much flexibility. And realistically, even if you are doing the incremental budgeting method, it probably requires a reset every few years at a minimum, where you can still kind of use or lean on the last year's or the last time period's budget, but you have to spend the time to be honest with yourself and recategorize the different topics or types of spend and savings goals as they change. It looks like we have a question that came in real quick. So it says, what software/tracking system do you use to track your personal income and expenses? Certainly was expecting that to be asked, and it's something that we're going to hit on here. But I guess a couple things I'll say to that. We don't, in my opinion, budgeting is a very personal or personalized approach, meaning there's no really one solution that fits all. I think there's so many resources out there nowadays, whether it's all the various apps that can link up to your bank statements and credit card statements and help you categorize things that way. Me personally, I'm pretty old school. I've kind of just gone and searched for different Excel templates, budgeting templates, and I basically track my budget on Excel. And I know that's kind of an older school approach, but for me, it's easy to go in there and to manually enter things in. And that's my way of being honest with myself. But in terms of like the apps that are out there, I haven't used enough of them to, fully endorse them. Again, because there's so many that I don't feel confident in saying which one's better than the other. I guess, again, it kind of comes down to what you like and what's going to work best for you. There's so many free apps out there, so I would encourage everyone to try a couple different ones and see if it works for you. But again, ultimately, it comes down to how you're going to be honest with yourself and stay disciplined over that budgeting time period.
I think it'll depend too on what type of budget you want to use. And so as we can see, we've talked about two types of budgets. There are a couple more we're going to touch on here. This next one is the one that I think we would both recommend. But this might facilitate you using a different software than if you were going to go with a zero-based budget or an incremental budget that might be a little bit more involved. The pay yourself first budgeting method is the first bill you pay after your taxes and your debt, of course, would be savings. So when you look at your income or your cash available for your budget, savings is already taken out of it, and you've already factored that out. And that's the way that we would recommend budgeting, because then you don't forget to save. You don't have the opportunity to make an excuse not to save. It's done for you, and it's going to happen every single month or every single year, whatever the time frame is. That also would change your approach to kind of measuring your budget or which app to use. If you're going to use Excel like Joe and I do, maybe this makes more sense because now you're just trying to make sure that the cash flow coming in can be enough to get you through whatever period you're looking at versus trying to split out expenses on a monthly basis or anything like that. And so the pay yourself first budgeting method is kind of a combination of that zero-based and incremental. But the key difference there is that before you even start to look at the budget, before you even start to think about cash flow, your savings is taken out of the equation.
Yeah, that goes back to the first slide of setting goals. That's why it's so important to set those goals early on, really even before you start developing the budget, because especially if you're using this pay yourself first, you kind of back into how much you can spend on a monthly basis by establishing how much should you be putting away on a monthly basis. That number probably is going to look different for everybody. A general rule of thumb, and we'll talk about kind of prioritization of cash flows here too, but general rule of thumb, at least starting out in your career, is putting away 15 to 20% of your income, whether that's for savings or paying down debt. But so it's going to look different for everybody. But being able to back into your budget is why you want to set these goals, the short, mid, long-term goals early on, because then that kind of help you determine how much to spend on a monthly basis. And so for some people, and this can tend to be the habit of my wife and I, where we are making sure that the savings kind of comes off the top, or we automate the savings right away to the 401k, to the savings account, to paying down debt, whatever it may be. And then the rest of it kind of goes into what sometimes I call the black hole or the void of our checking accounts, where we know that this is kind of how much we have to spend on a monthly basis. And, I'm honest with myself. I know that not every month we stick to the different categories and limits within each one, but we know that kind of once we run through that checking account, or the black hole, as I call it, of funds, then you kind of you're capped out on the month. And so that just goes back to what works for you. But by doing this pay yourself first method, you know that even if you're not sticking to the exact categories you've laid out for the budget that month, you're at least taking care of the savings part. That really, in my eyes, is probably the most important piece of the overall puzzle.
There's a couple other budget types out there that you might hear about. An envelope budget was popular a while ago. Sometimes there's apps out there that'll help you kind of make this envelope budget in a more tech-forward way. Essentially, what that was is each category of spending had its own envelope, and you'd put cash into each one. And as soon as you ran out of cash in that particular envelope, you couldn't hit that category again. Not a bad way to do things, especially for that discretionary piece. It's a little inflexible and not really practical from a cash standpoint. Now you're not going to go actually fill up envelopes, I don't think, with cash and use that to spend. But it's an interesting concept, especially for the discretionary piece. So you're not getting out of balance with, one type of entertainment, or one spouse is spending all the entertainment dollars and the other's not. Other one that we just touch on real quick here is the 50-20-30. This goes to your disposable or your income after tax, and you say, we're going to just split it percentage wise on needs, savings, and wants. This factors in that 20% number that Joe was just talking about. This can kind of be a little bit, again, hard to follow on an every month basis, just because some months there's needs that exceed the 50%. Some months there's wants that kind of creep up on you, and just seems like a good rule of thumb, but I don't know that I'd be building a budget based on that. Here's an example of your pay yourself first method. So if you were making $100,000 as your salary plus bonus, first few things you're going to take out, as you can see here before we get down to the bottom, are taxes and savings. After you take out your taxes and your savings, you get down to a total spending amount at the bottom there. This maybe be Joe's black hole of $66,000. And, obviously there's another step to this where we'd say, okay, well, what are the needs that need to be paid for first? And so those would come out of that 66, and then you'd get into more of that zero-based budgeting or that incremental budgeting. But you'd start off the top by pulling the savings out with taxes and kind of thinking about your net cash flow net of the savings rather than thinking about that as part of the budget.
Yeah, in terms of execution, ongoing management of a budget, I mean, we kind of hit on this a little bit, but again, just going back to my comment earlier, really, there's not a one size fits all solution. And I really mean that. I work with people that are, implementing budgets on a daily basis, whether it's people that are starting their careers or approaching retirement and trying to drill down on what they're going to spend in retirement. Everyone does it differently. And, a lot of people ask the same questions. And my response is always, it's about how you're going to stick to it, whether it's, using these apps, using the Excel sheet, or just doing the pay yourself first method and knowing that everything else that's kind of in the black hole is what you can spend on a monthly basis. Really, it's about being honest with yourself and understanding, what's realistic. Let's set realistic expectations for what we're going to spend on these different categories, what we're going to spend in general, and tracking your progress. Whether it's, again, everyone does it differently. Some people are looking at their budget on a weekly basis and going through and adjusting as necessary. Some people do it on a monthly or semi-annually basis. The biggest thing or the most important thing is to actually go in there and track your progress, and make adjustments as necessary. Again, because if you create a budget at the beginning of the year and you don't look at it until the end of the year, and you realize that you're way off on everything that you had or that you set, then kind of what was the point of doing the budget in the first place? So again, it's just a matter of being honest with yourself, and how you operate in terms of if you'd be willing to check it, or how often you'd be willing to check it, and again, what types of resources that you would like to use over that time.
I think as you're managing your budget, reevaluating your budget, there's two components really to it. There's the budget that's cash flow, spending, et cetera, that we're talking about here. But the other piece of it that should be looked at periodically is progress towards those long-term goals. And so, making sure that the savings is getting to the point that you think it needs to for whatever particular goal you have in mind, whether that's a down payment for a house, it's retirement, it's some other cause that you're saving for. But looking at those longer term goals and the progress towards them on a periodic basis will help inform that budgeting process as well.
That all kind of leads us into the saving strategies, or really kind of, going back to the short-term, mid-term, long-term goals. What kind of accounts, or I guess once you establish these goals, that can help you figure out what types of savings accounts or investment vehicles to use to kind of target or get on your way towards those goals. And again, automating savings is a big piece of this. We talk a lot about how much you should save, saving off the top, things like that. But okay, now that you're saving, where should you be saving to? And really, how should you prioritize money? I think the biggest thing here is, and this next slide here is my favorite slide to show. But again, I mentioned this earlier, but the power or the importance of establishing these savings habits early on. This slide, what this shows us is basically how much you need to save on a monthly basis. The bottom is all the different age ranges. How much you need to save on a monthly basis to get to $1 million in retirement at age 65. And so we're using a 6%, a pretty reasonable 6% growth rate on this. But what you'll see is if you start saving at age 20, you can put away $360 a month from age 20 until you're 65. And if that's growing at 6%, that'll get you to $1 million at retirement. This is excluding taxes, so this is all pre-tax. But if you wait just 10 years, again, if you say, I've got all the time in the world to save for retirement, so when I get to my 30s, I'll start saving. You already have to start saving double per month than what you could have been saving if you started 10 years before that. So it already doubles to $698 at that point. And then, to take it even a step further, if you wait until call it your peak earnings years of 40, 45, 50, you can see how much larger the amount is on a monthly basis that you just save for retirement. So to me, this is one of my favorite slides, because it really shows the impact of compound compounding growth and the power of investing over time and continuing to add to your investments.
And I think the point is, don't get to 60 because saving $14,000 a month is pretty hard for most people. So try to get your saving in before you get to age 60.
That's fair to say. Real quick, kind of before I get into the prioritization of cash flows or how to leverage the different account types available to you, I'm just going to do a quick overview of the different types of accounts that most people have access to. Starting off is kind of the employer provided retirement plans. So a lot of people are familiar with the 401ks, 403B, 401A, 457 plans, those, all the different types of plans that employers offer. The 403B, 401As are usually for nonprofits or a lot of times you see it for hospitals. But 401k is generally the one that most people are familiar with or potentially have access to through their employers. But really, these are qualified retirement plans that are offered by most employers these days. Again, whether it's a public or private employer, generally, so the 401k, a lot of times most plans offer a pre-tax 401k option or a Roth option. And for those that don't know, a pre-tax or kind of the traditional 401k is the money that you put into the 401k, you get tax deduction for it on the front end, and it grows tax-free over time. But when you pull it out in retirement or when you're spending it, you get taxed on every dollar that you pull out. Versus a Roth 401k or contributing to the Roth bucket of your 401k, it's after-tax money now, so you're paying the taxes on it now. It grows tax-free, and then when you pull the money out later on, you don't pay tax on it. So in other words, you pay the taxes now, and then it's out of the tax system for forever. So 401ks in 2024, the contribution limit is $23,000 that you can put in as an employee. There's a catch-up contribution that's allowed if you're 50 or older of like $7,500. So then the contribution limit is $30,500 if you're 50 or older. But then there's also IRAs, or it's called individual retirement accounts. These are separate vehicles. They commonly kind of get intermixed or confused with 401ks. But an individual retirement account is something that you can open up on your own, so outside of your employer. And again, there's pre-tax or traditional IRAs, and there's Roth IRAs. The same tax rules apply for those, but the contribution limits are a lot less for IRAs. You can put in 2024, it's $7,000 that you can put to an IRA, whether it's Roth or traditional for you. And again, there's a catch-up contribution when you're 50. That's $1,000, so $8,000 would be the contribution limit. There are income limitations for IRAs. So if you're above certain income thresholds, you're not able to contribute directly to a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA. The income limits are different. I won't get into all of that, but it is another savings vehicle that people have access to. Biggest thing on these two is these are savings or accounts that you use for long-term or retirement savings. There's generally penalties that are associated with accessing these funds before age 59 and a half. And again, you're paying taxes on every dollar you pull out of the pre-tax 401ks or IRAs. And then there's also, standard brokerage accounts or taxable investment accounts. I kind of view this or explain this as it's really an equivalent to a bank account in terms of you put after-tax dollars into it, but a brokerage account gives you the ability to access investments, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, you name it. It's another savings account or investment account that you can open on your own to be able to invest or kind of to grow for a longer term growth. There's different ways that you can title these accounts. If you're not married, just be an individual brokerage account in your name. If you're married, you can open up a joint brokerage account. It's really the same way that bank accounts work in that manner. And again, you put after-tax dollars in it, you get taxed on any income generated throughout the year, dividends, interest, etc. And then on the back end, if you have some gains or there's some growth in those accounts, you pay capital gains taxes when you sell positions at a gain too. So again, it doesn't have the same tax benefits as the 401ks and IRAs do. And then of course there's savings accounts, bank accounts, money market funds, things like that we're all familiar with. But again, it's the most liquid and usable type of funds, and it's the type of accounts that we're going to leverage for that rainy day fund. And again, go back to what I said earlier, those, in my eyes, those short-term expenses, the 3 to 5 year expenses, are not meant to be invested or grown, or I guess taking risk in the market. That's meant to be in savings and liquid cash equivalent investments. And then there's education and like custodial accounts for kids. So 529 plans, covered L, ESAs, UTMAs. These are more accounts that would be geared towards your children, and we won't get into the weeds on those today, but it's worth mentioning. So prioritization of cash flow. So we talked about going back to the example of putting away 15 to 20% of your income, starting out. So I'll use the example of somebody starting out their career. In my mind, these next two slides are kind of how you should view or how you should prioritize your cash flow as you're trying to figure out where that 15 to 20%, if that's what you're earmarking, should be going towards. So first and foremost,
be clear when you say prioritize cash flow. This is prioritize the savings of this. This is just how to prioritize the savings piece of the cash flow.
Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying. So not the budgeting aspect in terms of expenses on a monthly basis. This is meant for the savings component, or the part that you're earmarking for to put away on a monthly basis.
Is it fair to say that if you went through your budgeting process, you spent your money and you got to the end and you had leftover, that the leftover and you wanted to save that leftover, you would follow these same guidelines?
Yes, for sure. And I think that's a good question, because I think the second slide that we'll show you here is kind of in my eyes, for those leftover funds. I think this one is in my mind kind of a no-brainer for the amount that you're saving automatically on a monthly, annual basis. This is how I would prioritize it. Kind of the first one, first and foremost, is if you do have a 401k or 403b plan through your employer. Most employers offer an employer match these days. So it could be they match, 3%, or they make a 3% matching contribution up to your 3% of your income. Or in other words, you have to put away 3% into your own 401k plan, and then they'll also toss in 3%. This is a no-brainer. The first thing you should do is make sure you put in enough in your 401k to get that match. Otherwise, it's just money that you're leaving on the table from your employer. Again, most employers offer these some sort of a match these days. And again, I also generally say, if you're early or younger in your career and you have a Roth 401k option, you want to start off doing Roth, because the mindset is that you're probably in lower tax brackets now than you're going to be later in your career, and really even when you're pulling the money out in retirement. So take advantage of these lower tax rates. Use the Roth 401k option, and contribute at least enough to get the employer match. That's 3, 4, 5% is kind of the general amount that we see. The next one is paying off high interest debt. And so kind of what I qualify as high interest debt would be anything 7% or higher. You could argue that anything above 6% would fall into this too, but really what I'm talking about here is more so like the credit card type debt, the ultra high interest debt that people may have. It could also be, you could have a car loan. Interest rates have been higher over the last couple of years. So if you've gotten a car in the last couple of years and your loan is higher than 7%, I would prioritize paying down these higher interest debt or loans more so than saving for retirement and some of these other things that we'll talk about. Because the thought is, if this debt over here is growing at 7%, but you're earning 4 or 5% on cash on the savings side, you're better off paying down that high interest debt than you are adding to your bank account or to your investment accounts. I will say this next one, saving into emergency market or kind of building up that emergency fund, is also extremely important. In some situations, I may say that it goes before the paying off high interest debt. And the reason I say that is, general rule of thumb is you always want to have 3 to 6 months of your monthly spending needs in savings or kind of in that emergency fund. The general idea is that if you're a homeowner and the AC gives out, or you get in a wreck, or you have a big unexpected cost, you have this buffer of cash or this emergency fund to fall back on. What you don't want to have happen is you don't have any cash or enough cash built up, and all of a sudden you have an unexpected expense, and you have to go put everything on your credit card, and it can restart the debt cycle, even if you had already paid off everything at that point. So these two can kind of be interchangeable. It depends on the situation. If you have credit card debt that's earning 25% interest, I would pay that down first, prioritize that. But if it's just say a car loan at 7%, it might make sense to prioritize building up that emergency fund earlier on, and then once you kind of get to that 3 to 6 months cushion, then focus on paying down that debt. This next one really only applies if you have a high deductible health plan that's offered through your employer, or if you're on the ACA exchange and you have a high deductible plan, you can contribute to a health savings account. It's a no-brainer if you have access to one. You get a tax deduction for contributions that you put in the HSA. You could invest or grow the funds, and they grow tax-free. And then it's a tax-free distribution as long as you're using it for qualified health expenses. So contribution limit in 2024 is $4,150 for an individual or $8,300 for a family plan. Again, just kind of a no-brainer if you have access to it, but not everyone does. So going back to your question, Steve, on kind of, in my eyes, this would be more for somebody that gets to the end of the year and has excess funds, or someone that's maybe making a lot more money, a little bit more established in their career, and that 15 to 20% of their income is a lot higher than it was when they were 22 or 23. Going back to increasing, I guess let me start with, this kind of goes back to your short-term, mid-term, long-term goals. And the reason I say that, so the order of this is basically saying, with the excess funds, you can come back and max out your 401k or 403b. So if you started out by just doing the 3 to 5% to get the employer match, and then you have the excess funds, then you can come back here and contribute up to that 23,000 or 30,500 if you're over 50, to maximize your contributions for the year. If you do that and you still have excess funds, then you could potentially go contribute to a Roth IRA or traditional IRA up to that $7,000 or $8,000 a year. Again, there's income limits that apply to those, so you need to be careful on them. Then we go down the list and potentially paying off lower interest debt. Now, I generally say the mortgage type debt is a pretty good debt to have, is what we normally say. Again, interest rates have been a little bit higher over the last couple of years, but generally speaking, paying off lower interest debt, I would say, is 5% or more. So if you have a mortgage at 3% or 4%, generally in most situations, I don't recommend prepaying on that or paying that down, because you'd be better off putting that money away in savings, because you're probably going to get more than 3 or 4% if you have a good investment philosophy or approach. But yeah, so paying off that lower interest debt. And then if you get through all of those things and you still have excess funds, that's when you can start maybe saving to a taxable investment account, really, because you've already used up all those pre-tax or the tax favorable accounts, but you can still add money to a taxable brokerage account to be able to grow those funds in the stock market. And I guess going back to the goals, where this is different for everyone else is, so using me as an example, my next one, that was the next one that would have been ahead of maxing out my 401k for me the last 5 years, has been adding more to my savings account. So after I knocked out getting the employer match, paying off any high interest debt, saving to the HSA, my next one was coming back and saving more to my savings account for my down payment on my home, or for the wedding ring, or for a car, whatever my short-term expenses have been. I kind of prioritized those expenses more so than I did focusing on maxing out the 401k. And that's why there's not really a perfect solution for everybody or a perfect rule of thumb, but generally this is a pretty good guideline to follow. And I think, Reagan, we're going to send this out to everybody later this afternoon. But if you're going to take away anything on the savings side of things, to me, these two slides are a pretty good guideline or roadmap for how you should prioritize your excess cash flow.
Okay, I think we have a polling question coming up here for those of you who are getting CPE. So please fill out the polling question here. We'll give you 30 seconds or so to do that. All right, we're going to continue on with organizational budgets. This would be for not-for-profit organizations and for businesses. I think this is, hopefully some of you are on here for this, but we started with the individual piece. A lot of those same components can be applied, or the same theories can be applied to an organization. I'll talk about a couple of, So we'll talk about a couple different ways that organizations or businesses typically budget. But, going back to what was driving the need to budget, what was driving the theory and the strategy behind budgeting was, what are the long-term goals? What are the goals of you as an individual for your individual budget? The same thing is true here for an organization. It's really important to understand what the organization's long-term goals are and when major cash flow needs are coming up. That'll dictate, how we're investing funds, how we're distributing funds to owners, how we're handling our cash. All of those things are going to be contingent upon how we execute towards those longer-term strategic goals. A couple different approaches. One that we see typically executed by an organization is a departmental approach, where each department kind of sets their own budget. They say, here's how many folks I expect to have on staff. Here's what their salaries are. Here's, how many supplies I need to get my job done in the next year. They put in all of that information, and potentially if the department is a revenue center, they'll give their own estimation of what their revenue would be. This is great for getting buy-in from all different departments, from parties all over the organization. Can be pretty accurate from a revenue perspective. I think sometimes this approach gets jumbled when everything gets put together, especially on the expense side, because if I'm part of a department and I'm putting in an expense for something that would be considered an overhead expense that another department might also be spending money on or might also be using, that can tend to duplicate expenses, or potentially, nobody's budgeting for it because they assume the other person is. So sometimes on the expense side, when we go with the departmental approach, it ends up being a little inaccurate on the expense side, can be a little bit more accurate on the revenue side. This approach tends to be really time consuming. It puts the budget into a lot of different folks' hands and relies on them to meet deadlines to get their budget done. And then it will require, generally speaking, taking different formats and combining them into one cohesive budget. So the other approach, which we've talked about on the individual side, is more of an incremental approach. And this is one that with our outsourced accounting clients, we've implemented and had really good success with. We look at the overall organization and say, okay, which accounts, which expenses do we expect to increase kind of as inflation does? We're not going to have any material changes in a lot of our overhead expenses other than prices just going up year over year. We move those accounts first, and then we focus on the accounts that are going to be part of a strategic change to the organization. We would focus on revenue, highly focus on revenue. And that might be where you kind of combine the approaches and you go back to the departments and say, from our incremental approach, we need to get a better handle on what's happening with revenue and make sure that those costs, or make sure that those revenue centers are giving you the information you need to produce an overall budget for the organization. And so maybe we're moving everything incrementally with inflation, but we're moving some accounts incrementally based on growth in customers, based on growth in employees, and on the expense side, based on variables that kind of are unusual or aren't just, every year type of things. So that would be really how we approach the organizational budgeting. And we found that approach to be a lot more effective in terms of getting the budget accomplished in a reasonable amount of time. Probably lacks a little bit of the buy-in that you get from the departmental approach. So work that back in through revenue, I think that would help. The impact of organizational budgets is huge. We see a lot of organizations not have a budget, and they continue to go through the motions of producing whatever it is they're producing and get to the end of the year and they make money and they're happy and it's great. But for organizations that are really trying to grow, really trying to change their business, having a budget and a plan to get strategic alignment with their finance department, with their funding sources, and what their longer term goals are is really crucial for organizations. And I think it really helps keep people on track. It also reduces surprises in cash flow. We talked a little bit about that month where you get a big credit card bill and it kind of surprises you and comes out of nowhere. Same thing is true for businesses. And a lot of times we see, oh, our AR got a little bit out of control. We ran out of cash and we had to pull from our line of credit, or our owner had to contribute some money to cover payroll. Well, if we would have planned a little bit better, maybe that wouldn't have happened, or we could have seen the fact that we were going to run short on cash a few months ahead of time and done something about it, like secure a line of credit instead of having to go to the owner's pocket. So reducing surprises in cash flow, holding folks accountable, and then making sure that the goals and the finance department are in a strategic alignment so that the organization can continue to grow or achieve its goals over time.
Do you see very often that, if you're working with a company that, maybe has been doing a budget a different way or doesn't have a very good budget in place, that once they actually organize a budget, whether it doesn't matter, I guess, what type of budget it is, but having more of an organized approach to it to kind of get the strategic alignment. Have you seen that it can actually result in increasing revenue over time once they have a better understanding of their actual expenses and the potential growth of those expenses? Again, I guess the reason I'm asking that is on the individual side. I've seen that once you get a better idea of your expenses and these goals and how much you should be saving, once you realize potentially your limitations on a monthly basis for spend, it can actually be kind of a boost to your career growth or desires, because you realize you have to start making more money to be able to do the things that you want to do. I mean, do you see that on the organizational side a little bit too?
For sure. I think a lot of times we think about this from a business model perspective, or some of these expenses are tied to different types of revenue, and going through the budgeting process helps businesses and organizations understand those connections. So do we need to hire another person if we're going to grow revenue here? Or how much is our cost of goods sold going to go up if we increase this piece of revenue? And it will help business owners or not-for-profits understand, where their key drivers are, where their key performance indicators are in terms of how does profitability increase the most? How do I keep costs down the most? How do I grow revenue? And which revenue should I be focused on growing? I think we see that a lot, and it really does help move people in a direction where the organization can be more successful because they understand those relationships.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense.
Do we have a question? So we had a question that was, we always see $1 million as a retirement goal. Is that stated as an individual or a couple's goal? If an individual had $1 million at age 65, what would reasonably be the annual income from this? I'm going to let Joe handle this one.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very fair question. I would say there's no significance to the $1 million. You're right. It tends to be a pretty common number that you see or is talked about in retirement, or a lot of people think, what is my target? What is my retirement target for assets to have when I'm be safe to walk away? It's probably not the answer that you necessarily want to hear, but in my eyes, that $1 million doesn't have significance. It is a completely individualized or unique amount. We always say there's never really a nest egg target, because we get this question asked all the time. What should my nest egg be? There's so many different variables to factor in to retire, or kind of what's enough to retire. And we never really focus on the amount to have. It's more focused on, projecting out your guys' cash flows over a 30, 40, 50-year period. And that looks different for everybody. it comes down to, you know, how much does each person or each couple spend on a monthly or annual basis? You know, what's their lifestyle? Do they have other income sources coming in retirement? You know, do you have real estate? Do you have Social Security? All these other things. There's too many factors to really have a number in mind that you should be shooting for. Because again, it just really comes down to each person's situation. And I would say in terms of what would be a reasonable, you know, annual income from this, I think that the number that you would read in kind of the classic retirement books would be 4% is a reasonable you know, dividend and interest rate to assume. You know, I think that number also completely changes based on your risk allocation and types of investments that you own. So I think that 4% is kind of I would call it a stale or a not, I guess, customized number for each person, because again, there's just so many variables that go into each person's individual situation and how we would recommend investing your assets. You know, does it make sense to be more conservative when you retire? Again, it all comes down to, you know, what are your portfolio needs in retirement based on other income sources, your level of spend. So, you know, in my mind, that the million is completely just a number that everyone can relate to, not as much of a goal for retirement.
So in conclusion, power of budgeting. Budgeting allows you to take control of your finances and really get to your financial goals, whether that's $1 million in retirement or, you know, saving for your down payment on your house. And effective budgeting strategies involve, you know, understanding those financial goals and really setting them, and then regular reviewing that budget and making sure that you're on track to save towards those goals and get to the finish line of what you're trying to accomplish. Any other questions for us before we're done here? I think we got a couple minutes left here.
Yeah, we'll give it a second here, but I guess I'll add, you know, feel free to you know, reach out to Reagan or to one of us if you have any questions that you either didn't think of on this or didn't want to ask, you know, to the group. So me and Steve would be happy to answer any questions or hop on a quick call, and you know, hopefully this was beneficial to everyone that was watching. And again, I know for me at least, I always think of questions way after the fact, from when I was actually should have been asked them. So feel free to reach out, and we'd be happy to have a conversation or answer any questions.
Yep. Thanks for joining us today, and again, reach out with anything.
Yep. Thank you very much.